Sunday School leaders. We are looking at week 5 this week of our unit entitled Beauty from Ashes, Redeeming Your Broken Moments. This week we're looking at redeemed from devastating failure out of both Luke 22 and Acts chapter 4. And the main point of the lesson is that God can redeem us from even our worst failures. As you think about the people in your class this week, each of them probably has had some kind of failure, a different degree of failure in their life. And a lot of times we will take and internalize those failures and say there's no way God can use me, or God can't use me because I've done such and such. And so this is an encouraging lesson as we look at Peter and his failure. I mean, it was an outright denial that he even knew who Jesus was, and how Jesus took him, restored him, and then as a result, in Acts, we see that as he was empowered by the Holy Spirit, he was able to preach and preach boldly. So he went from being kind of cowardly to being a very bold witness. As you think about some of the failures of folks in your class, I know there are probably failed marriages. Some people probably think they're failures because their kids that they tried to raise in a godly home turned out to be just a bunch of boneheads. You've got some examples of possibly moral failure, that you might have some students in your class that have really messed up. And so hopefully this will be an encouraging lesson to people who have experienced moral failure or who have experienced failure in their lives, that God can still use them. It's also encouraging to remember folks who maybe have not gone down some of those paths, but to look at people differently, because just because a person has really messed up doesn't mean that God can't use them. So when somebody in our congregation, somebody in our Sunday school class, maybe one of our friends or family, has some kind of failure in their life, usually we will err on one of two extremes. We'll maybe turn a blind eye to it, maybe not even talk about it, hope it goes away. Or we may go to the other extreme where we, either in our minds or to their face, kind of condemn them and maybe banish them from our sight, or banish them from their ministry or whatever. So one of those two extremes people will do an awful lot of times. But what we need to do is confront if needed, forgive if needed, and then restore. And we see that happening with Jesus's experience with Peter. There are just a couple of things I want to mention today that they're more application type issues that you can bring up about the lesson this week. As we look in Luke, the Luke passage, we see that Peter followed Jesus at a distance. And we're talking, of course, at a physical distance. He kept his distance from Jesus as Jesus was being led and being tried and being questioned and all that. Peter kept back at a distance. I guess a question to ask the class is, how do we occasionally, and sometimes people do most of their lives, follow Jesus at a distance? Talking more figuratively, how do we keep that distance between us and Jesus to where we're following Jesus, but he's pretty distant. We're not right there as a disciple, as a learner, as a true follower. We've got him in our sights, but he's way off in the distance. So how are some ways that people do that? I think that'd be a good question. Also, we see, of course, that Peter denies Jesus 3 times. A question to ask might be, how can we, or how do people today deny Jesus without saying, I don't know who he is, or any of those things that Peter did? How are the ways that we deny Christ today? Are we not as vocal with our faith as we should be? Do we try to hide our faith and maybe not tell people that we're church attenders, or that we teach Sunday school, or those kind of things? How is it that we deny Christ in 21st century America without actually coming out and saying that we deny him? And then once we're convicted that we've truly erred, that we've done wrong, as Peter did when he heard that rooster crow that second time, it sunk into him the words that Jesus said. What is our response? Peter wept and wept bitterly. What's our response? Is it, oh, I got caught, I'm sorry, Lord, please forgive me, and let's go on our way? What's our response? How do we respond? Do we really respond as we should? As we get over into the Acts passage, I wonder how bold we've ever been Could we ever be as bold as Peter? See, Peter went from being a little coward. He was hovering in the distance away from Jesus. He went from that into just a short time. He was a very bold witness. Didn't matter what the circumstances were. Didn't matter what the outcome was going to be. If he was going to be thrown in jail or beaten or killed or whatever, he didn't care. He was going to proclaim Christ. Of course, a big difference between Peter in Luke and Peter in Acts is the Holy Spirit. He was empowered by the Holy Spirit. So that's a question. We have that same Spirit. Why are we not as bold as we need to be? So that's just a few things to think about as you go through this week's lesson. Next Sunday will be our last Sunday in this unit. And then the following Sunday, we'll have just a one lesson special emphasis lesson on that Sunday. That's all I have for now. Hope you have a great weekend, and I hope to see you Sunday.